The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital emergency room buzzed overhead as I clutched my chest for the third time that day. Not again. Please, God, not again, I whispered, my heart threatening to burst through my ribs. I'm Marco Romano, and 6 months ago, I was living what most would consider the American dream, a successful Italian restaurant in downtown Chicago, a loving family, and a life I had built from scratch after immigrating here 30 years ago. But dreams can shatter in the most unexpected ways. It started with a single episode during our busiest dinner service. One moment I was expediting orders, calling out, "Table 7, quattro primi," in my usual voice, and the next, I was gripping the steel counter, my vision tunneling and my lungs refusing to work. My son Antonio found me in the walk-in freezer 20 minutes later, shaking like a leaf in October. The doctors called it panic disorder with agoraphobia. I called it my personal prison. Within weeks, I went from managing a staff of 25 to barely managing to step outside my bedroom. The attacks came like clockwork, morning, afternoon, evening, and sometimes in the middle of the night. Each one felt like a heart attack, and each one stripped away another piece of my identity. The proud restaurant owner became the man who couldn't even answer his phone without his hands trembling. My wife Maria tried everything: breathing exercises, meditation apps, 3 different therapists. Antonio took over the restaurant operations, but I could see the worry in his eyes every time he visited. "Papa, you need to see someone else," he'd say, and I'd wave him off with whatever strength I could muster. In my culture, men don't talk about these things. We work, we provide, we stay strong. But there I was, neither working nor strong, just a shadow of myself counting the minutes between episodes. It wasn't until that 3rd ER visit in one day that I finally broke. Not physically, I'd been breaking that way for months, but spiritually. As I lay there, connected to monitors that beeped in rhythm with my racing heart, an elderly hospital chaplain named Father Thomas sat beside my bed. He didn't start with prayers or Bible verses. Instead, he asked me a simple question that would change everything. "Marco, when was the last time you felt truly at peace?" The answer brought tears to my eyes. I couldn't remember. St. Mary's Hospital became my second home, its corridors a maze of hope and despair. Father Thomas visited daily, his weathered face carrying the kind of peace I desperately craved. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step accompanied by the soft tap of his wooden cane against the linoleum floor. "God's timing is perfect, Marco," he'd say, settling into the chair by my bed. "Even in this sterile place, he's planting seeds." Dr. Sarah Chen, my assigned psychiatrist, brought a different kind of comfort. A petite woman with quick movements and quicker wit, she surprised me by starting our first session with, "So I hear you make the best risotto in Chicago." She'd done her homework, reading about my restaurant in local food blogs. But more importantly, she understood something I didn't yet grasp, that healing would require both medical wisdom and spiritual insight. My family's daily visits created a rhythm to my hospital stay. Maria would come in the mornings, armed with homemade soup and stories about regular customers asking for me. Antonio handled the afternoons, bringing paperwork I couldn't focus on, and patience I didn't deserve. My daughter Sophia, a college student studying psychology, would FaceTime in the evenings, her academic knowledge mixing with daughter's love, as she encouraged me to trust the process, Papa. But it was Nurse James, a tall Caribbean man with hands gentle enough to change IV lines without waking patients, who first noticed something peculiar. "Your attacks," he observed during a particularly rough night, "they never come when Father Thomas is here." He shared this observation with Dr. Chen, who raised an eyebrow and made a note in my file. That note would later prove crucial to my recovery. The hospital chapel became my sanctuary during the hours between panic attacks. Its stained glass windows filtered the harsh Chicago sunlight into soft blues and golds, creating patterns on the floor that reminded me of my grandmother's church in Naples. There, in the quiet moments between beeping monitors and overhead announcements, I began to feel something stirring. Not peace exactly, but the possibility of it. The breaking point came during week 2 of my hospital stay. Dr. Chen had suggested reducing my anti-anxiety medication, believing it was time to try something new. "Your body's responding well," she explained, "but we need to address the root cause." That same morning, Father Thomas had mentioned something about spiritual warfare and taking authority over fear. Their words collided in my mind like opposing storm fronts. The first panic attack without full medication hit like a freight train. My chest constricted, sweat soaked through my hospital gown, and the fluorescent lights seemed to scream at me. "I can't do this," I gasped, reaching for the call button. But instead of Nurse James, Father Thomas walked in. He pulled out a small Bible and I nearly lost it. "With all due respect, Father," I snapped, my breath coming in short bursts, "I need a doctor, not a prayer book." The words came out harsher than I intended, born of fear and frustration. The old priest simply nodded, placed the Bible on my bedside table and sat quietly as I struggled through the episode. Dr. Chen's approach wasn't working either. The breathing exercises felt like they were suffocating me. The cognitive behavioral therapy techniques seemed to bounce off my racing thoughts like rain off a window. Even Maria's unwavering faith, she'd begun attending daily mass at the hospital chapel, irritated me. "You can't pray away panic disorder," I told her during one particularly difficult morning. The restaurant started slipping. Antonio called with news that our sous chef was leaving, taking some of our family recipes with him to a competitor. Sophia's psychology professor suggested that my condition might be generational trauma, manifesting as anxiety. Everyone had a theory, a solution, a way forward that felt like a dead end to me. One night, alone in my room, I hit rock bottom. The monitors started their familiar warning beep as my heart rate climbed. In desperation, I grabbed Father Thomas's Bible, not to read it, but to throw it across the room. As it hit the wall, it fell open, and a small piece of paper fluttered out. A prayer card with my grandmother's handwriting on it, written in Italian decades ago. I hadn't even known it was there. The prayer card opened a floodgate of memories. My nonna's kitchen in Naples, where she would recite prayers while rolling pasta dough, her flour-covered hands moving in rhythm with her words. The same hands that would press against my chest when I had childhood asthma attacks, her touch somehow making breathing easier. "Respira con Dio," she would say. "Breathe with God." The restaurant's problems multiplied like loaves and fishes, but not in the miraculous way. Antonio called with updates that felt like body blows. Our longtime maitre d' quit, unable to handle the tension of my absence. Regular customers, sensing the change in atmosphere, began dining elsewhere. The recipes our sous chef took weren't just instructions. They were stories, memories, pieces of our family's legacy bleeding away. Maria's own struggle became increasingly apparent. I caught her crying in the hospital chapel one afternoon, clutching her rosary. She'd been bearing the weight of everyone's expectations, being strong for me, supporting Antonio at the restaurant, counseling Sophia through her studies, all while maintaining her job as a high school Italian teacher. Her faith, usually a solid foundation, showed cracks under the pressure. Sophia's psychology studies began to mirror our family crisis. She called one evening, excited about a research paper she was writing on the intersection of faith, culture, and mental health in immigrant families. "Papa," she said, her voice tight with emotion, "I'm writing our story." Her professors praised her insights, never knowing they came from watching her father unravel in real time. The hospital staff noticed how these family dynamics played into my recovery. Dr. Chen observed that my panic attacks intensified after business updates, but eased following Sophia's calls. Nurse James noted how my vital signs stabilized when Maria prayed in Italian by my bedside. Even the night shift nurses began timing their rounds around these family patterns, creating an unspoken support system that bridged medical care and family bonds. My grandmother's prayer card changed everything. Written in her flowing script was a simple practice she called La Preghiera del Respiro, the breath prayer. Father Thomas found me studying it the next morning, tears streaming down my face. "Your grandmother," he said softly. "She understood something many of us forget. The same breath God used to create life can be used to restore it." Dr. Chen's interest was immediately piqued when I showed her the card. "This is fascinating," she said, adjusting her glasses. "It's similar to some mindfulness techniques we use, but with a spiritual anchor." She began taking notes as Father Thomas translated my grandmother's words, her clinical expertise merging with his spiritual insight. The technique was deceptively simple. During moments of panic, I was to inhale slowly while silently praying, "Dio è qui," God is here, and exhale with, "Io non ho paura," I am not afraid. But the power lay in what my grandmother had added at the bottom of the card. "Remember, Marco, you're not just breathing. You're breathing in God's presence and breathing out your fear. Like kneading dough, each breath works His peace into your soul." My first real test came that afternoon. As the familiar tightness gripped my chest, I began the practice. Inhale, Dio equi. The words of my childhood faith, spoken in my mother tongue, seemed to bypass my racing thoughts. Exhale, Io non ho paura. My grandmother's kitchen materialized in my mind, the scent of fresh bread mixing with whispered prayers. For the first time in months, a panic attack began to recede instead of escalate. Father Thomas and Dr. Chen worked together to refine the technique. She added elements of grounding, touching the cross around my neck while breathing, focusing on the weight of my feet on the floor. He incorporated relevant scripture that resonated with my Italian Catholic upbringing, creating a bridge between my cultural faith and present needs. Your grandmother's wisdom, he explained, was in understanding that faith isn't just spiritual. It lives in our bodies, our breath, our very cells. The monitors told the story before I could. My heart rate stabilized faster during episodes. The intervals between attacks lengthened. Something was shifting, not just in my body, but in my soul. As Maria watched the change in me, she began incorporating the breath prayer into her own daily routine. Even Antonio, initially skeptical, started using it while running the restaurant kitchen. Word of my improvement spread through St. Mary's like a whisper in church. Nurse James started directing other anxiety patients to the chapel, where Father Thomas now spent extra hours. Dr. Chen began documenting what she called the Italian breathing intervention for a medical journal, though she admitted that the spiritual component defied traditional clinical classification. My first victory came during a video call with Antonio about the restaurant. As he described another challenging service, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. But this time, instead of disconnecting the call, I closed my eyes and began the breath prayer. Dio è qui, io non ho paura. Antonio fell silent, watching his father face fear instead of running from it. When I opened my eyes, he was crying. "Papa," he said, "you're coming back to us." Maria noticed other changes. The tremor in my hands, steadied enough to hold my grandchildren's drawings without crinkling them. I started reading the Bible Father Thomas had left, not just holding it. During her daily visits, we began praying together in Italian, our native language carrying emotions English never could. Her own anxiety, which she'd hidden for years, began to surface and heal as we practiced the breath prayer together. The hospital staff incorporated these developments into my treatment plan. My medication dosages were gradually reduced. The emergency response team, which had become all too familiar with my room number, started celebrating each day they didn't have to rush to my aid. Even the cafeteria workers noticed I was eating better, my appetite returning as the constant knot of anxiety in my stomach began to loosen. Sophia called it a holistic healing cascade in her research paper, but to me, it felt more like standing in sunlight after a long storm. Each breath prayer was another ray breaking through, illuminating not just my own path, but those of the people around me. 3 weeks after discovering my grandmother's prayer card, I took my first steps outside the hospital. The Chicago wind hit my face like a splash of cold water, but instead of triggering panic, it reminded me to breathe. Dio è qui, with the wind's approach. Io non ho paura as it passed. Dr. Chen walked beside me, her clipboard forgotten as she watched her patient embrace the world again. The breath prayer began transforming our restaurant in unexpected ways. Antonio had taught it to our remaining staff, and they'd created a ritual of using it before each service. Our new sous chef, a young man from Sicily, said it reminded him of his own nonna's kitchen prayers. Customers began commenting on the renewed sense of peace in the dining room, though they couldn't quite identify what had changed. My recovery sparked something in Father Thomas, too. He started a weekly support group in the hospital chapel, combining traditional spiritual guidance with the breathing technique. God's peace speaks all languages, he would say, as people from various faiths found comfort in this simple practice. Dr. Chen often attended these sessions, taking notes but also participating, bridging the gap between medical and spiritual care. Maria's transformation was perhaps the most profound. After years of being the family's rock, she allowed herself to acknowledge her own struggles with anxiety. Together, we started attending marriage counseling with a Christian therapist who incorporated our breath prayer into couples exercises. Our relationship deepened as we learned to breathe through difficulties together rather than bearing them alone. The practice evolved as I grew stronger. During particularly challenging moments, I added physical elements that connected me to my faith and heritage. I would hold my grandmother's rosary, feeling each bead as I breathed. Sometimes I'd knead bread dough while praying, the rhythmic motion becoming a meditation of its own. Sophia called it embodied spiritual practice in her research, but I simply thought of it as having a conversation with God through my hands as well as my breath. Even my relationship with panic itself changed. Rather than seeing it as an enemy to be defeated, I began recognizing it as a signal to turn toward God. Each episode became an invitation to practice presence, to remember that divine help was just a breath away. The day Dr. Chen mentioned discharge, a familiar tightness gripped my chest, but this time it was different. The fear wasn't of panic, but of leaving the safety of St. Mary's. The hospital had become my upper room, where I'd learned to breathe in God's presence. Could this peace survive in the chaos of the real world? Father Thomas sensed my apprehension. "Remember Peter walking on water," he said during one of our final sessions. "He didn't sink because of the storm, but because he stopped looking at Jesus." We spent that afternoon preparing a spiritual action plan, combining medical guidelines with prayer strategies. Dr. Chen added her own notes. "Your grandmother's technique works because it engages both body and spirit. Trust that connection." The ultimate test loomed ahead, returning to the restaurant kitchen. Antonio had scheduled my first visit for a quiet Monday afternoon, but plans changed when our biggest critic announced he was coming Saturday night. "He's doing a follow-up piece," Antonio explained, his voice tense, "about how the restaurant has changed since—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Maria and I spent hours in the hospital chapel practicing for this moment. We wrote scriptures on small cards to place around the kitchen, each one a reminder to breathe. The staff prepared too, learning to recognize early signs of anxiety and creating quiet spaces where I could step aside to pray if needed. Even Sophia flew home from college to be there, bringing her research findings as ammunition against fear. The night before my discharge, Nurse James brought me an unexpected gift, a small professional-grade kitchen timer. "Set it to remind you to breathe," he said with a knowing smile. "Same intervals we used here." Dr. Chen approved this practical addition to my recovery plan, while Father Thomas blessed it, saying, "Even Jesus took time to step away and pray." This simple tool would become crucial in the days ahead. Saturday night arrived with the weight of a final exam. The restaurant buzzed with nervous energy as news of the critic's impending arrival spread through the staff. I stood in the kitchen's doorway, my hand instinctively reaching for the rosary in my pocket. "Dio e qui," I whispered, stepping into the familiar chaos of my domain. The kitchen timer, now programmed with gentle chimes, reminded me to pause every 30 minutes. Each time it sounded, I'd step into the walk-in freezer, the very place where Antonio had found me during my first attack, and practice my grandmother's technique. The staff worked around these moments seamlessly, having incorporated them into the kitchen's rhythm. When the critic arrived, my heart rate spiked. The monitor watch Dr. Chen had insisted I wear blinked its warning, but this time, instead of fear consuming me, I felt something else. My grandmother's presence, Father Thomas's wisdom, my family's love, all wrapped in the peace that came with each breath prayer. "Io non ho paura," I exhaled, reaching for the first order. The evening unfolded like a well-rehearsed symphony. Each dish left the kitchen with a prayer. Each return plate came back clean. I moved between stations, tasting, adjusting, breathing. The critic ordered multiple courses, each one a test of my stability. When he requested my signature risotto, the very dish I'd been preparing during my first attack, I felt the entire kitchen hold its breath. Standing over the pot, stirring with the same wooden spoon my mother had given me decades ago, I began to pray in rhythm with the motion. Stir, breathe in God's presence. Stir, breathe out fear. The rice released its starch in time with my breaths, creating the creamy consistency that had once made us famous. As I finished the dish with my grandmother's secret touch, a pinch of saffron and a whispered blessing, I realized I was crying, but not from panic. The critic's face when he tasted the risotto told us everything. He closed his eyes, lowered his spoon, and did something I'd never seen in all my years of cooking. He crossed himself. Later, we would learn that his own grandmother had been from Naples, and something in that dish had brought him home too. The critic's review, published the following Sunday, went far beyond our food. "There's something extraordinary happening at Romano's," he wrote. "A sense of peace that's as much a part of the menu as the handmade pasta. In an industry known for chaos and pressure, this kitchen has found something profound, the secret ingredient of grace." Dr. Chen framed the article in her office, using it as a testimony to the power of integrating spiritual practice with medical treatment. Father Thomas began regular sessions at the restaurant, teaching our breath prayer technique to other business owners struggling with anxiety. The hospital's mental health unit even started incorporating elements of the practice into their standard care protocol. But the real miracle wasn't in the public recognition or professional validation. It was in the quiet moments, helping a young server through her first panic attack using my grandmother's technique, watching Maria lead prayer before each service, seeing Antonio teach his children to breathe with God while making Sunday gravy. The very crisis that had threatened to destroy our family had become the foundation for deeper healing. I still keep my grandmother's prayer card in my pocket, now laminated and worn smooth with daily use. Sometimes, when I'm in the kitchen late at night, I imagine her smiling as I teach others to knead dough and pray in rhythm with their breath. The panic attacks haven't completely disappeared. Dr. Chen says they might never fully go away, but they've become something different now. Reminders to pause, breathe, and remember that God is here. Today, Romano's hosts monthly Breath and Bread workshops, where we share both our cooking techniques and our prayer practice. The waiting list is 3 months long. Dr. Chen and Father Thomas often join us, and together we're developing a program to help other restaurants become spaces of healing. My grandmother's simple prayer has touched hundreds of lives, one breath at a time. If you're struggling with anxiety, know that you're not alone. God's peace is just a breath away. He can transform any life, any workplace, any situation. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message of hope. Have your own story of transformation? Share it in the comments below. Your testimony might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.